afternoon, and thank you for joining me. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Je me joins à vous aujourd'hui pour discuter des constatations de 3 audits que mon bureau a présentés au Parlement ce matin. Ces audits ont examiné comment des organisations gouvernementales ont géré d'importantes initiatives fédérales, y compris le remplacement du système de paie du gouvernement, les réformes du programme des étudiants étrangers et les efforts de la GRC pour recruter le personnel policier. I will begin with our audit of the federal government's project to modernize its pay system. Overall, we found that the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat and Public Services and Procurement Canada were managing the project to ensure that the federal public servants' pay will be accurate and on time once the new Dayforce system is launched. The audit identified risks. The Secretariat and the Department have an opportunity to address them because the project is in its early stages. The need to simplify and standardize pay rules before introducing a new system was a core lesson learned from the transition to the Phoenix pay system. It is concerning to me that a decade later, there has been little progress made to simplify pay rules. As a result, the department is customizing Dayforce at an estimated additional cost of almost $4 million per year. We also found limited progress in clearing the backlog of requests to fix employees' pay. As of last September, more than 233,000 pay transactions remained outstanding, affecting more than 133,000 public servants served by the Miramichi Pay Center. This creates a risk of transferring existing pay errors into the Dayforce system, which could undermine its effectiveness from the start. In January of this year, Public Services and Procurement Canada shortened the schedule by 3 years to onboard departments to Dayforce. Although this decision is intended to reduce the complexity and cost of running 2 systems in parallel, it means less time to clear the backlog and prepare departments for the transition. Nous avons conclu que le secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor et Services publics et Approvisionnement Canada ont géré le projet de modernisation de la paie de façon à assurer aux fonctionnaires fédéraux une paie exacte et versée à temps. L'audit a relevé certains risques. Comme le projet est à ses débuts, le secrétariat et le ministère ont la possibilité d'agir pour les corriger. Je demeure toutefois préoccupée par 3 éléments. D'abord, les progrès faits pour simplifier les règles de paie étaient limités, ce qui entraîne une personnalisation du système Dayforce avec un coût additionnel évalué à près de 4 millions de dollars par an. Ensuite, l'arriéré de 233 000 opérations de paie persistait, créant un risque de transférer des erreurs dans le nouveau système. Et enfin, l'échéancier écourté de 3 ans réduit le temps disponible pour éliminer l'arriéré et bien préparer les ministères pour la transition. Le gouvernement devra donc maintenir une attention soutenue et prendre des décisions rapides à mesure que ce projet avance. Passons maintenant à notre deuxième audit, dans lequel nous concluons qu'Immigration, Réfugiés et Citoyenneté Canada a mis en œuvre les réformes du programme des étudiants étrangers pour réduire le nombre de nouveaux permis d'études, mais avec des lacunes importantes à d'autres égards. Le gouvernement fédéral a annoncé en janvier 2024 qu'il plafonnait les demandes de permis d'études. La même année, le ministère a délivré un peu moins de 150 000 nouveaux permis, soit beaucoup moins que le nombre prévu de presque 350 000. Nous avons constaté que les provinces moins peuplées avaient été touchées de façon disproportionnée par ces changements. Par exemple, Terre-Neuve et Labrador et la Saskatchewan ont connu une diminution d'au moins 59 % du nombre de permis approuvés par rapport à 2023, et non une augmentation prévue de 10 %. La situation s'explique par la baisse du nombre de demandes et par l'approche du ministère pour établir combien de permis seraient traités dans chaque province. En réponse à des préoccupations connues au sujet de l'intégrité du programme, le ministère a mis en place un outil pour valider les lettres d'acceptation émises par les établissements d'enseignement. Cependant, le ministère n'a pas fait d'enquête ou de suivi efficace dans le cas d'étudiantes et d'étudiants déjà au Canada qui avaient été signalés comme étant susceptibles de ne pas respecter les conditions de leur permis d'études. Environ 153 000 cas de ce type ont été signalés pendant 2023 et 2024. Mais en raison de son financement, le ministère a enquêté sur environ 4 000 cas. L'audit a aussi révélé que le ministère n'avait pas donné suite à 800 demandes de permis d'études comportant des documents frauduleux ou des fausses informations découvertes après l'approbation de la demande. Dans la plupart de ces cas, les personnes en cause avaient ensuite demandé d'autres permis d'immigration alors qu'elles se trouvaient au Canada et plus de la moitié de ces demandes avaient été approuvées. Le ministère doit utiliser l'information dont il dispose pour régler les problèmes d'intégrité qui touchent ce programme. Our second audit concluded that Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada reduced the number of new study permits issued, but fell short in other key areas. In 2024, the department issued just under 150,000 permits, well below the forecast of 350,000. Some provinces, particularly those with smaller populations, were disproportionately affected. For example, Newfoundland and Labrador and Saskatchewan were both expected to see an increase of 10% in approved study permits compared to 2023, but instead experienced a decrease of at least 59%. While the department introduced a tool to verify acceptance letters from learning institutions, it did not effectively investigate or follow up on high-risk cases. Over 153,000 potential cases of non-compliance with study permits were identified, but the department only investigated a small number. It also did not pursue 800 cases involving fraudulent documentation discovered after permits were approved. Overall, the department needs to act on the information it has to address integrity concerns in the program. Our final audit looked at whether the Royal Canadian Mounted Police recruited enough officers to meet operational needs. This is important because the RCMP has faced a growing shortage of police officers. Although the force made recruitment a top priority, the targets it set fell well short of actual staffing needs, and it failed to meet those targets. As of September 2025, we found that the RCMP needed at least 3,400 police officers. Shortages of frontline officers in contract and Indigenous policing were widespread across Canada. As of September 2025, vacancy rates were above the force's critical threshold in 9 out of 11 of the provinces and territories it serves. These high vacancy rates pose a clear risk to the RCMP's ability to maintain capacity to deliver policing services. Slow application processing was a key factor impacting recruitment efforts. The RCMP missed its target processing time for 97% of the applications it received. This made it harder to fill training classes. Some classes were canceled, and fewer cadets were trained than expected, further contributing to the shortages. In 2023, the RCMP introduced a flexible posting plan that allowed new officers to choose the province or territory of their first assignment. The plan succeeded in attracting thousands more applications. However, it also increased chronic vacancies in some areas. In July 2025, the RCMP began phasing out the use of this plan. Chronic shortages of frontline police officers make it difficult to deliver policing services across Canada. The RCMP must determine how many police officers it needs and set recruitment targets to fully staff the force and reduce the impact on existing officers. En ce qui concerne le recrutement de la Gendarmerie royale du Canada, l'audit a conclu que la GRC n'a pas réussi à recruter suffisamment de policiers et policières pour répondre à ses besoins. Les cibles de recrutement fixées par la GRC étaient inférieures aux besoins et n'ont pas été atteintes. Des délais importants dans le traitement des candidatures a freiné le recrutement. La GRC n'a pas respecté le temps de traitement prévu pour 97% des candidatures. En septembre 2025, il manquait au moins 3 400 policiers et policières. Les pénuries de personnel en première ligne étaient généralisées au Canada, surtout dans les services de police contractuels et autochtones. Les taux de postes vacants étaient critiques dans 9 sur 11 des provinces et territoires desservis par la GRC. Un plan d'affectation flexible a attiré des milliers de candidatures, mais a aggravé les pénuries dans certaines régions. La GRC doit définir ses besoins d'effectifs et fixer des cibles pour les atteindre. En conclusion, ces 3 audits soulignent l'importance d'une planification rigoureuse et des mesures prises en temps opportun pour gérer les risques. Sans ces éléments, il peut y avoir des retards et des conséquences imprévues qui nuisent à l'atteinte de résultats positifs pour le Canada. Together, these 3 audits highlight the importance of careful planning and timely action to address risks. Without these elements, there can be delays and unintended impacts that stand in the way of positive outcomes for Canada. Thank you. Merci. I'm now ready to answer your questions.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll start with questions in the room. I would ask everyone just to ask one question and one follow-up so that we can get through as many reporters as possible. We'll start with David Baxter from the Canadian Press.
Good afternoon, Ms. Hogan. Thanks for taking the time today. I just want to get your thoughts on something Minister Diab said during her appearance at the Immigration Committee. This happened while you were at the Public Accounts Committee, so I don't imagine you had a chance to hear her comments. But she was talking about how this audit just captures the preliminary stages of reforms they're bringing in, stressing that it only covers 18 months of what she's calling a multi-year process, and only 4 months of that is when she was the minister. Just what do you make of this initial response from Minister Diab when being asked questions about some of the serious concerns you raised about integrity in the system?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the reforms that were brought about for the program had two objectives, right? One was to see a decrease in the number of study permits, and we saw that decrease was sharper than intended. And it brought about unintended consequences, right? There was certain provinces that instead of receiving an increase saw a decrease. So I would expect that even though it's early on in the reforms, that there would be collaboration with partners in the provinces and in the post-secondary institutions to make adjustments if needed, if this was not the intended outcomes. But I think when you look at integrity, while there were some adjustments made to improve the integrity of the program, what's concerning for me is that the department isn't acting on the information that it has. There are so many things that were raised by the department themselves and then no follow through. So, for example, the 153,000 cases of students who were potentially identified as not following the terms of their permit. While only 4,000 were investigated, within those 4,000, about half of them were closed because the students stopped communicating with the immigration department. I would expect that they'll take that all the way through. That should be happening no matter where you are in the reforms. That should be acting on the data you have to preserve the integrity of programs should be something that's worried about at the start when you get an application, throughout the application, and then when the application or the permit has expired.
Follow up on that, I want to ask about the 800 some odd visas that were approved and then ultimately found maybe there was like a bogus applicant acceptance letter used or some other thing that would make the visa, potentially that would make the visa invalid. You said that the investigations and the follow-up here in the audit, you were told that follow-up is discretionary, but the lack of that follow-up could create a cascade of issues, including not flagging if these people applied for another kind of immigration permit. Did you ever get a concrete reason as to why this discretionary look wasn't taken?
No, there is clearly tools in their toolkit, things that they can do when they believe that fraudulent documentation was used or if a student isn't following the conditions of the permit. And we didn't see them consider that in these 800 cases. I think it's important to know their own risk processes identified these 800 cases, but then no action was taken. And when we looked into where they were, that's when we found out that the majority have applied for some other permit, a renewal of a study permit, a work permit, permanent residency, or asylum. And to date, about half of them have been approved. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't have been approved, but the absence of having a warning or something on their file to say fraudulent documentation or misrepresentation was used in the initial application means you weren't able to then apply rigor on the second application. So I think they're just not acting on the information they have, and I would expect them to do that. They have the powers and the tools. They just need to use them.
Thank you, and we'll go to Rafi Bouchikanian from CBC.
Thanks very much. Hi. If the IRCC doesn't have, say, enforcement powers to compel students who won't answer their questions to come up with more answers, I'm wondering what role you think more funding might play in helping them sort out these cases, since they told you they only have funding for 2,000 cases a year.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think here you should first effectively use the funding that you have. And as I mentioned, of the 4,000 investigations that we saw them use, they weren't really, I think, taking it to the end, right? Closing a file because a student stops communicating with you is not uncovering whether or not they are actually following the conditions of their permit. One key element being studying full time. Right, so I would expect that they'll act on that information before they decide if they need additional funding or resources to use in a different way. But their powers can be something as simple as putting a warning on a file, so that the next time the individual applies for something, you can apply more rigor at that point. Right, it is about managing the risks as a student applies and first enters Canada, managing it while they're in Canada, and then seeing whether or not they follow with the conditions once the permit has expired, which means leaving Canada or applying for another permit.
I just want to switch over to the RCMP report. I'm wondering how quickly you think the Mounties can realistically turn their recruitment efforts around.
That's an excellent question, and I hope one that you'll ask the RCMP commissioner. I know that I had a great conversation with him about the biggest sort of bottleneck, which is the slowness of processing demands or request applications to the RCMP. When you're doing it in, on average, 330 days, that's a long time. Their service standard is much lower. We talked about why that was happening. Well, an analyst at times who picks up the application and is supposed to move it through the process, well, over half of those positions were vacant. The steps are all done one after the other instead of concurrently. And the commissioner and I talked about ways of, moving those around. And I know he's seized with that. I think publicly he's talked about already getting help to move it forward. How realistic will that be? Well, I think it'll depend on whether or not you set yourself measures to see if your attempts are being successful. All right. For example, they use that flexible posting plan to be able to determine, to increase applications and see if they could get more police officers. There was a great increase in applications, but it had an unintended consequences on aggravating vacancies in certain areas. So being able to monitor that and adjust as you go is something that I think will help them be successful in speeding all of this up.
Thanks. And we'll go to Frédéric Pépin from Radio Canada.
Oui, merci. Bonjour, Mme Hogan. Sur Phoenix, le système de paie, pouvez-vous nous dire, est-ce que vous pensez que le gouvernement agit assez rapidement pour régler les arriérés? Dans votre rapport, vous faites état de 230 000 transactions qui sont en attente. Mais on voit dans les statistiques du gouvernement fédéral qu'en date de février, là, quelques mois après les statistiques de septembre, ils sont déjà ils sont à 216 000. Donc, ça continue de diminuer l'arriéré. Est-ce que vous pensez que le gouvernement en fait assez? Vous, est-ce que vous pensez que le gouvernement aura complètement réglé tous les arriérés avant l'entrée en vigueur de Dayforce? Et est-ce que c'est ce que vous souhaitez?
Je pense que chaque employé qui a une demande en attente dans l'arriéré souhaite que ça soit traité avant que Dayforce débute. Parce que si tu emmènes des erreurs de paye dans un nouveau système, tu vas avoir des erreurs de paye. Ça ne changera pas même si tu changes la boîte. Right? Si tu emmènes de l'information erronée, la paye va être erronée. On a vu du progrès. C'est certain qu'il y a eu du progrès dans les arriérés. Ils ont priorisé les ministères qui faisaient la transition dans la première vague. Une bonne idée, mais ça a causé moins de diminution dans les arriérés pour les autres ministères. Mais je suis plutôt préoccupée par les arriérés de longue durée. Il y a au-delà de 50% des arriérés, ça fait plus que 2 ans qui sont en attente. 16 000, ça fait plus que 6 ans qui sont en attente. Le plus longtemps que tu attends, le plus longtemps que ça va être pour régler l'arriéré. Il va y avoir de la difficulté, de la complexité, encore plus complexe si l'individu ne travaille plus dans la fonction publique. Alors, je pense que traiter les nouvelles, c'est facile et on peut faire du progrès, mais il ne faut pas oublier que ça va prendre beaucoup de temps, je pense, à passer à travers. Alors, il y a beaucoup de chemin encore à faire, mais je souhaite qu'ils les enlèvent toutes parce que ça va aider à éliminer les erreurs dans un nouveau système.
Vous dites que le gouvernement a quand même beaucoup de travail à faire et devra continuer de travailler pour régler là, ces problèmes-là avant l'entrée en vigueur. Justement, avec les réductions d'effectifs qui sont prévues dans la fonction publique, vous avez dit vous-même, il y en a des gens qui quittent la fonction publique, ça demande des problématiques, mais le fait qu'il y a moins d'employés ou de personnel qui peut travailler sur ces arriérés-là, est-ce que ça vous inquiète, justement, pour pouvoir arriver aux objectifs?
Je pense qu'une des leçons apprises de Phoenix était de ne pas enlever tout l'effectif quand on fait un changement de système de technologie d'information. Des fois, ça en prend plus même une fois qu'il y a un nouveau système avant de voir que tu peux diminuer les effectifs. Mais les changements de quoi vous parlez, je pense que ça l'amène à un autre risque. Alors, il faut avoir de la vigilance à gérer les risques qu'on connaît maintenant, les risques que nous autres, on a identifiés dans notre DI, mais aussi les risques à venir dans le futur. Et alors, la vigilance de toujours faire un suivi est nécessaire. Puis quand on raccourcit l'horaire par 3 ans, ça en amène encore un autre élément de risque que je pense que j'aimerais voir les plans être ajustés avant qu'ils vont trop loin là, dans le futur, parce que 3 ans, c'est un long temps pour adresser l'arriéré et préparer tous les ministères.
Thanks, and we'll go to Catherine Morrison from the Canadian Press.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to ask you questions about 2 of the reports. The first is on the RCMP. It seems like the RCMP incorrectly determining its recruitment needs may be a political problem, not a bureaucratic one, since the police force was tying its expectations for intake to its funding levels for hiring. Is that the case, or was it up to the RCMP to set higher recruiting targets that better matched its needs?
Well, I mean, I believe the RCMP had a lot of data that they could have used to better set its needs, and really it's about limitations in their workforce planning that resulted in targets that were well below what they needed. They made a decision to really focus in on contract and Indigenous policing, which is just one of their business lines, but it's the one where the majority of the police officers newly recruited start their job. But to think about the needs there, it's not just about what's in all your contracts and agreements. You have to think about the fact that you then take experienced police officers and move them to the other business lines. And they weren't thinking about that. And then you also have to think about attrition, which is something that wasn't factored in to their targets as well. So if you're measuring success at a target, but your target is well below your needs, then it stands to reason that you're not going to recruit what you need to provide adequate service.
Thanks. And secondly, on Phoenix, the report mentions that while the government has estimated replacing Phoenix with Dayforce will cost more than $4.2 billion, that the preliminary estimates didn't include costs for departments and agencies to transition to the new system. So I'm just wondering if you expect the total cost will continue to increase, and do you have any idea of how much the cost will be for the departments and agencies to transition?
Well, I do expect that the actual cost of making this transition will be higher than what's currently estimated. The $4.2 billion is a preliminary estimate. It's rough. There is a lot of precision that needs to be brought into it. But one of the concerns that we did raise was the important gap in thinking about the costs for all the departments and agencies that have to do the transition. I think this is an opportunity for the government to really think differently here and not to just think in silos, right? Don't just think about who manages pay and the central agencies and what that new pay system will cost, but think about the fact that every single department and agency will have to change the way they work, change their processes and on board. And that comes at a cost. Back in 2023, we did a report on IT projects, the health of IT projects in the government, and we found that many departments said they weren't innovating or changing or modernizing because they didn't have the funding. So here's an opportunity to think about the government the way a Canadian thinks about the government. We don't think about each individual department. We see this big government, and why not cost it out that way? And that's why we recommended that they think about the cost of everyone moving on over.
Thanks, and we'll move to Jillian Piper from Global News.
Thank you for taking questions. I noticed in the International Students Report that you mentioned neither the CBSA or the Immigration Department knew whether about 23,000 students with expired permits had left Canada. I wanted to ask you if you got any sort of clarity on that number or why they were unaware of the whereabouts of those students.
This is another example, really, of the Immigration Department not acting on the information that it has. So they had not identified or created a list of students who had expired permits. So my audit team sat down with them and we worked through all of their data and came up with this list of students with expired permits, and then cross-referenced if they had applied for other immigration permits. So that's how we came up with the little over 39,000 files. We then went to the Canada Border Services Agency and asked them, can you tell us who's left? And they confirmed that about 40% have left the country. So now it's really up to the Immigration Department and Border Services to decide what to do with those other individuals. But this is where I would expect greater collaboration between the two departments and better sharing of information, which is why we gave them a recommendation to work together. They can build on what we've done. We've given it to them so that they can try and repeat this and do it again.
I just want to clarify, I know you mentioned you compiled the list and specifically immigration to know. Was CBSA aware of these individuals, or were these individuals also new to them?
So this is the interesting thing, is CBSA does have access to the systems that Immigration Canada has, except they can only search for an individual. So they would actually need a name. And that it's the Immigration Department that has all of that information. They know who applied for a study permit and who has applied for another permit. And they should be the ones to sort of generate the first list and then let CBSA take action as they deem necessary.
Okay, perfect. And before I ask the next question, I'll just ask if anybody is on Zoom right now to please raise their hand if they want to ask a question. I'm actually going to be asking a question today. As I said, I work at CTV News. I just wanted to go back to the 150,000 students that you talked about that were identified as potentially non-compliant, and of that only 4,000 being investigated. And I just want to know, what should Canadians take away from that, and if they should be concerned that there could be so many people who are never investigated and could have issues that the department was never aware of?
Mm-hmm. I think I want to start off by saying there are thousands of students, international students that are in the country who are genuinely here to study and are complying with their permits. The process that identified the 153,000 students who are potentially not studying full-time was a mechanism that the department already has in place. Learning institutions must report to them on a regular basis if they believe a student isn't studying full-time, which is a condition of their permit. then I understand that there are limited resources. So the fact that only 4,000 were investigated is something that the department has to sort of manage where it puts its resources. But what's bothersome is that in that 4,000, 40% were closed without really identifying whether that student was studying or not, because they didn't communicate. So I would expect that the department will act on all of those. There were 50 found to not be studying. Then I would have expected that the department would have put a flag on the file or canceled a permit or informed Canada Border Services Agency, but we're just not seeing that happening. So it's this lack of acting on the information that they have was where they really need to improve if they want to improve the integrity of this program.
Thank you. And for my follow-up, I wanted to ask about the exhibit on page 6. I don't know if you have it, but it was just the one that showed that the number of applications that are approved were way under the forecasted projection. And I just wanted to know what you knew about why those approval rates were so much lower.
Mm-hmm. So I think the approval rates are driven by a few things. There was about a 54% decline in applications received between 2023 and 24, and then approval rates as well declined. What was surprising was that the immigration department couldn't tell us why these declines happened. So we did look at some of their integrity measures to see if maybe they were some of the factors. So for example, an increased financial requirement, but we saw that it had a very tiny impact on the number of permits that had been approved. So I would expect that the department will look into this. One of the big reasons I believe there was a decline, however, in the number of applications received was because they canceled the direct student stream, which in the past represented about 50% of the students that were receiving permits. So that clearly had an impact. And now it'll be important for the Immigration Department to work with the provinces and to work with educational institutions to decide whether adjustments need to be made if this was the unintended impact of these reforms.
Thank you. And we'll now move to our Zoom questions. If you are joining on Zoom and you have a question, please raise your hand at this time. And we'll start with Mark Ramsey from the Toronto Star. You could go ahead, Mark, if you're able to. I see that you've unmuted, I think, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
I can't hear you. Do you want to try again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now, Mark. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thanks for taking my question. I'm just wondering if you could, on the RCMP recruitment issues, as you know, the government has committed to increasing the total number of officers by 1,000 in the next few years. Can you just put that into what you found in that context? Like, a lot of the issues before have been about training capacity, and now we're talking today about applications and that kind of thing. Can you just do you see that as a challenge, them being able to increase that capacity by 1,000 people, given what you found today?
Yeah, so it's my understanding that those extra 1,000 police officers are not solely frontline police officers, and we did focus in just on the front line. So obviously, finding different ways to speed up how the RCMP gets through applications is essential. It isn't a shortage of applications. It's really that there's only 6% of them that ended up being invited to basic training at depot. So it is about speeding up the process. You don't want to eliminate the rigor in making sure that you have a suitable candidate, but you do really want to see the RCMP focus in on the 40% or so applications over our audit period that either withdrew their application or stopped communicating with the RCMP. And when we did survey some of them, many of them told us it was how slow all of this happened. So I think as you speed up getting more in is when you have to think about training capacity. So right now we saw that about 18% of classes were at capacity, but as you start to increase the number of officers coming through, you'll need to work on that capacity. Because they don't have capacity to train all of their needs. So they will have to figure out a way to increase that while they manage speeding up reviewing of the applications.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, and you mentioned that too, that this plan to increase the force by 1,000 new officers is mostly focusing on the federal policing side. The government has said that. Do you think, given what you found in, over 3,000 police officers short on the frontline side, is that a misguided direction? Do you think there should be more of a focus on addressing that before getting into the other side of things?
So, the federal policing side is the area of the business side that looks at domestic and international threats and security. And we did audits before on cybercrime and identified that there was chronic shortages in some key areas. So that is in that federal policing. So I think there's two ways to go about getting police officers right now. They do this big hiring through contract and Indigenous policing, so where a brand new police officer will start, and then the more mature police officers can move to the other business lines, or they hire mature police officers from other countries, or not other countries, excuse me, other police forces. All that does, however, is put a gap in a different place in Canada. So I do think that there needs to be efforts in both areas to meet the emerging needs of the RCMP, but it's clear that there needs to be focus on increasing the number of frontline police officers in order to deal with the chronic shortages.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We have just under 9 minutes until the press conference is scheduled to end, which doesn't usually happen. So if you have time, is there anyone else in the room who would like an additional follow-up? And if not, then we will end the press conference there. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Oh. What the heck? Okay. All right, let's start with...
you mentioned there were some pretty serious concerns with the integrity of our immigration system in light of the International Students Report. What was your reception to this report from the government department? Do you think there's a willingness to fix some of these gaps and use the tools that exist, as you mentioned earlier?
I flagged concerns in the international student program. I didn't look at all of immigration, just so that we can be clear. They were accepting of our recommendations, except for one that they partially agreed with, linked to how to measure whether or not they were increasing the diversity of the student population, so changing the source countries. But for the rest of the recommendations, they agreed with us. I think time will tell, like anything, when we issue recommendations, how they will act on it. And this is where I think parliamentarians and the media play an important role of keeping some pressure on the department to make sure that they act on our recommendations in a timely way.
Okay, thanks, Frédéric.
Merci. Est-ce que, en général, est-ce que vous diriez que vous êtes confiante ou inquiète par rapport à des forces qui s'en vient là bientôt? Vous soulignez plusieurs inquiétudes. C'est le même gouvernement en place depuis plusieurs années maintenant. Oui, ils sont d'accord avec vos recommandations, mais est-ce que vous êtes plus inquiète maintenant que vous l'étiez par rapport à vos autres rapports que vous avez faits à ce sujet-là dans le passé?
Alors, je pense que le projet est vraiment aux phases initiales. Et c'était une décision consciente que j'ai prise pour faire un audit au début, pour que je puisse être impliquée, que je contribue à la gouvernance et que je contribue à l'élaboration de risques et des mesures de mitigation. Je suis préoccupée parce que le délai a été raccourci par 3 ans. Je pense que ça va prendre du temps à passer à travers l'arriéré des transactions de paye. Ça fait, dans certains, au-dessus de 6 ans qu'ils existent, comme j'ai mentionné. Alors, je pense que je suis satisfaite qu'ils sont sur la bonne voie, mais je soulève des risques que je m'attendrais soient adressés et après un suivi continu. Tu sais, c'est pas juste, OK, on a trouvé un risque, on va le mitiguer aujourd'hui, mais c'est pour s'assurer que si on fait un autre petit changement, quels autres risques vont émerger et comment qu'on va les adresser. Ça prend vraiment de la rigueur. Je m'attendrais beaucoup de rigueur d'ici 2027. Puis après un ajustement, après les premières ministères ont fait la transition pour voir s'il faut ajuster le plan.
Okay, thanks, Rafi.
Sure, thanks. Hi. You were talking in your opening remarks about how smaller provinces were disproportionately impacted by the international student program cuts. Is there anything the government can do to reverse that situation?
Well, I feel like that's probably going to take some time to see the reverse. The decline was much sharper than was expected across some of the provinces. And as I mentioned, some smaller ones were expecting an increase compared to 2023 and saw about a 60% decrease. So I think this is where collaborating with their provincial partners and the learning institutions will be essential to see what adjustments, if any, need to be made to the program. But overall, the goal was to reduce the number of temporary residents by reducing the number of permits, and that was met, but just much sharper than I think anyone expected to see.
Okay, perfect. If we have no more follow-ups, I will end the press conference. Thank you so much for your time.